All right, so now we're going to talk about what's going on politically during the 1920s. And again, the term for the third time that shows up is return to normalcy. This mindset that we're going to get back to the Gilded Age, get back to conservatism, and all that type of stuff, where it's going to be isolationist and it's going to be pro-business. And it's also going to be an era where we see Republicans dominate. Well, Warren Harding for a couple of years, Calvin Coolidge for about 5 years, and then Hoover right towards the end of the 20s as it spills over into the Great Depression. And all three of them are not just Republicans, but conservative Republicans. So the progressive Republican mindset, like fighting Bob La Follette or Teddy Roosevelt, it's basically kind of dying off in this period. And so what ends up happening under these guys, conservative Gilded Age style policies are going to be implemented. And we start to see that first domestically, where you're going to see, like this picture indicates, this is going to be the roaring 20s, where our government gets out of the way, kind of lets business do what it wants to do, as evidenced by what this cartoon is showing you, and that's Calvin Coolidge playing the saxophone while the business community is dancing the Charleston. So it's just the artist trying to say, wow, business is doing whatever it wants, as opposed to progressive regulation that was kind of forcing big business to follow certain rules and protect social welfare of people and whatnot. All right, the first example of this is going to be Secretary of Treasury during this whole time period is a guy named Andrew Mellon. There's a picture of him. He's in the middle of Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover in that picture. Okay, and Andrew Mellon was the aluminum tycoon of the United States in this time period. So he was, some books say, the fourth or fifth wealthiest man in the country. And he's in charge of our tax policy, our basically economic position. And so as Secretary of the Treasury, he's going to implement what's called trickle-down theory, which for him was you cut all the income taxes of the Progressive era, which by the end of the Progressive era, income tax had replaced the tariff as our biggest source of revenue during World War I. Well, he's going to cut all those. The highest bracket was paying 65%. Now it's paying 25%. And so we're going to start to see how that happens. We get rid of some corporate taxes. We get rid of cut estate taxes in half, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're cutting a bunch of taxes that are generally paid by the wealthiest Americans, and we're replacing them with the Fordney-McCumber tariff, which is this much higher tariff. The tariff had gotten all the way down to roughly 20 to 25%, depending what product you're talking about under Woodrow Wilson's watch. Now it's going to be raised all the way up to 38 to 41%. So it basically doubles. So basically the tax burden is being put off the rich and being put on the working class and the middle class, the consumers of all our products, which shouldn't surprise us. This is something you would have seen in the Gilded Age, so it's something you're seeing in the 20s. And so with this, he's saying, but here's the thing. If you give more money to rich people, they will, quote unquote, trickle it down. Hence the title. They'll invest in factories. They'll invest in the economy. And eventually the overall economy will grow. And as it grows, then we're going to start to see how everything's going to get better and the economy will actually benefit the poor more than if we just had programs that supported them or taxes that didn't tax them. And so that's going to be part of what he does. Another famous thing that's going to happen as part of the return to normalcy is going to be the scandal that's associated with it. And most of that scandal ties to Warren Harding, as he himself is kind of a mess of a human. Just not a very bright guy. As Woodrow Wilson said, he was, he had a disturbingly dull mind. A lot of history books would say he looked the way a president ought to, which is not exactly a compliment. And he had a lot of scandals, a lot of them from his personal life, where he drank a lot, problem in the Prohibition era if you're the president. Had a lot of sexual scandal that we're not going to get into in this PowerPoint. But basically just kind of a shady guy. But the most famous of the scandals is going to be Teapot Dome. Teapot Dome, where basically the government under Harding was giving away oil to big oil companies and taking bribes to do it, to make a very long story short. And Harding was tied to it. He might not have understood what was going on, but he still signed the paperwork that allowed it all. And so when Harding, it looks like he's going to be impeached, but then in August of 1923, he dies. Historians are not quite sure why. Some say brain hemorrhaging, some say a heart attack, some say his wife killed him. People just aren't quite sure, but either way, the Teapot Dome scandal, which would have led to his impeachment, as you can see in this little cartoon, it ends up turning to nothing. And long story short, Calvin Coolidge takes over. As you saw in that picture, he's going to be a much more laid-back guy. Interesting stories about how he might have actually been struggling massively with depression. Very interesting stories tied to that. But either way, he didn't do a whole lot as a president. And so the business community kind of just did what it wanted. As trickle-down theory was fully implemented by 1924, the stock market's going to skyrocket. And so everything looks like it's going great in the 20s. and it might not stay that way. You probably heard that before. Now we move on to foreign policy. Now what's going on in foreign policy is a goal to distance ourselves from world affairs, especially world affairs that could potentially lead us into another world war if it were to break out. As you remember, Woodrow Wilson, as part of the Treaty of Versailles in World War I, tried to set up League of Nations and all these other things that would prevent a war from happening, and he largely failed. So what are the Republican presidents of the 20s going to do? They're going to try to kind of cement this failure and make us permanently an isolationist nation. We're going to see this at the Washington Naval Conference, where all the major countries of the world are called in an effort to disarm navies. And there's several treaties that are signed. The Four-Power Treaty, where the four biggest countries in the world agree to maintain the status quo in the Pacific. The Five-Power Treaty, where the U.S. and England and Japan and Italy and France will all agree to have disarmament in their navies, where England and the U.S. get 5 tonnage for every 3.5 tonnage of the Japanese and every 1.75 tonnage of the French and Italians, as you can see in this little cartoon that came out of Punch magazine, where England and the U.S. have the 5s. The Japanese, on the other hand, have 3.5. So what's happening in this picture is you see the figure who's supposed to represent the Japanese basically pointing at the Americans and British and saying, well, why do you get 5 and we only get 3, which is kind of a foreshadowing of what's going to be coming down the road, as in order to get the Japanese to agree to that, the English and the Americans had to agree to unfortify all their Pacific possessions. So as we skip ahead about 15, 20 more years with the Japanese aggressively pursuing power in the Pacific by attacking China, attacking the U.S., attacking England, attacking the Dutch, attacking the French. All these unfortified islands are going to come back and haunt the allies that agreed to them. But either way, we're seeing this. And then there's a 9-power treaty between those 5 countries and Belgium and Italy and Portugal and the Netherlands and China. Not Italy. Italy wasn't in, or Italy is part of the 5, excuse me. And basically the 9-power treaty just gets everybody to agree that the open door in China will be maintained. So long story short, historians looking back at this realize the point of the Washington Naval Conference was because a lot of the people in the world thought the Japanese government was going to be the next threat in the world, the next country that would try to aggressively pursue imperialism or some kind of foreign policy domination. And so this was supposed to weaken them or supposed to communicate to them that they could not do it. And skip at about 15 years, you'll see all these treaties getting burned up by the Japanese government as they violate basically all of them. Okay, another example of how the U.S. was trying to distance itself from potential things that could lead to war was in Germany, where Germany was supposed to pay reparations in the 1920s and beyond, and they weren't able to pay, as the French and English had insisted they pay over $30 billion. It got to the point where the Germans couldn't. And so the French military, or the French and the English, basically tell the Americans, hey, we're not paying you debt we owe you, because the Germans aren't paying us debt they owe us as part of reparations. And so the Americans, under Calvin Coolidge, say, well, you need to go in and get that money. That's our money. And so the French invade Germany, which causes economic crises. They print a ton of money. Hyperinflation ensues. Their economy collapses. In the midst of that, you have the famous event where Adolf Hitler gets up and does his Munich beer hall putsch and all that stuff, where he goes to jail for it. But it's creating a crisis in Germany, a crisis that's going to lead to a political collapse. And so the Americans step in, not wanting to see a collapse of Germany lead to potential unrest in Europe. And we proposed the Dawes Plan, which in essence, as you can see on this chart, although this chart is a little bit too simplistic, the U.S. government is going to start loaning money to Germany. So that's the U.S. government. The Germans can then continue to pay their reparation payments to the Allies, and then the Allies can then make their war debt payments back to the U.S. The difference is the war debt payments don't go to the U.S. government. For the most part, they go to U.S. banks. So ultimately what's happening is the U.S. government is giving money to Germany to give the Allies to give to U.S. banks. So not a big surprise in a return to normalcy that the government is taking on bills so that banks can make money, but that's something you would expect in a return to normalcy era. And it's supposed to basically create safety nets so that Europe doesn't collapse and these reparations keep getting paid. But as you can tell, if your IQ is anything above average, it's not going to work, because at the end of the day, they're just transferring debt from one group to another. And so this is very much a short-term solution. By 1929, it's not working anymore. By 1930, it's failing. And then by 1934, once Hitler sadly takes over Germany, he's going to announce that they're not paying reparations anymore. And so, long story short, the whole thing does end up collapsing, but the Dawes Plan is just an attempt by the U.S. to slow down the collapse or potentially prevent it. And then by 1928, we're going to see the most famous manifestation of this isolationist sentiment that's going on in the 20s, and it's going to be the Kellogg-Briand Pact, where the Kellogg-Briand Pact was an agreement among 63 nations to outlaw war as a means of conducting foreign policy. What you end up seeing, like this political cartoon is saying, is that on the one hand, the U.S. and all these other countries allegedly are shrinking their navies, even though we're actually building more cruisers. It's a long, complicated story. Even though in the midst of this, we have this Kellogg Pact that outlaws war. So what are we supposed to believe? Is the world actually moving into a period where war has been outlawed and there's going to be peace? Or is war just imminent, and these are all more just things that got passed to appease large-scale populations that oppose war and would like to see it go away? But either way, you take the Washington Naval Conference, the Dawes Plan in Germany, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and they indicate on the 1920s, this return to normalcy, we have a trickle-down theory, we have scandal involving the business community, we have a desire to be more isolationist, and then we have, attacks on labor unions that we saw on the other side coming out of the courts. We are back in a Gilded Age style mindset. And now we move into why the 20s ended, the Great Depression. Okay, and so the Great Depression is going to be this big event that's going to change history, and we'll just see all these major developments as a result. Okay, on the one hand, you have the 1920s were a myth, right? In the 1920s, allegedly it was the Roaring 20s. But in many ways, and the economy was growing. GDP was definitely going up each year. It was definitely going up towards the end of the 20s. We started the 20s with a recession, but by the end of the 20s, it was going up quite a bit, and the stock market was going up even more, the most famous component of the 1920s economy. But in reality, it really wasn't doing that well, because on the one hand, farmers were struggling this time period, which we'll talk just a little bit more about in a minute. And a lot of the people, even though the economy was growing and incomes were going up on average, as we saw in the Gilded Age, a lot of that was actually being steered towards the upper classes. Okay, on the one hand, by the end of the 1920s, and this is before the Great Depression sets in, it's only going to get worse once the Depression sets in. Over 40% of Americans were living 40% below the poverty line. And over 60% of Americans were living 20% below the poverty line, which means that basically during the 20s, a lot of people were doing real well. A lot of them lived in cities. They were adapting all these consumer lifestyles, buying cars, buying radios, et cetera, But in reality, many people were suffering, and just people weren't too concerned about that. So the Roaring 20s were the Roaring 20s, but that wasn't all that was going on. And so in many ways, the 20s was a period for a pretty good economy, but not as good as people would have you believe. Okay, one of the things contributing to that was tax policy, because taxes obviously freed up money for the wealthy. Like, that's what trickle-down theory is designed to do. And whereas the wealthy did reinvest some of it back into the economy and built factories and innovation, stuff like that, a lot of it just went to the stock market, which doesn't always directly or sometimes even indirectly lead to job creation or wages. And so you're just not going to see how that helped. The other thing tax policy did is by raising tariffs. Okay, these tariffs are going to make the product of every single thing in America more expensive. And so basically, with the burden being placed on working class people to pay more of the tax load, and then with the price of everything going up, our consumer economy isn't doing that well. So another cause of the Great Depression is that our economy was too heavily focused on consumer spending. A typical healthy balance for an economy between the consumer sector, the producer sector, the government sector, and the foreign sector would be like 60% or 65% of your economy being based on consumer spending. By the end of the 1920s, it was almost 82%. So that's just too much. And the problem with too much of it being based on consumer spending is that if anything interrupts consumer purchases, that can destroy the overall economy rapidly. For example, unemployment can do that, or, wide-scale pandemics like you see with the Spanish flu, or sadly right now. But long story short, if your economy is too heavily focused on consumer spending, then it's going to be too fickle as it pertains to adapting to changing times. And that's something we're going to see in the 20s. Another thing that's killing us in the 20s is that there was a lot of growth in the 20s, but there was also a lot of overproduction. We see that in farms, where with the development of the technology called the tractor, farmers can just grow massive amounts of crops now, even more than before. The problem is, whereas that's great for the consumer because food prices go down, it's terrible for the producer as the crop prices go down, and that's their income basically. And so farmers were suffering. Long before the Great Depression, farmers were already the hardest hit groups of Americans, with farm incomes during the 1920s going down over 25, almost 30%. And so you take away the fact that farmers make up over 25% of our workforce, and their incomes were dropping rapidly all throughout the decade where things were supposed to be good. That's a problem. The other problem with overproduction is that's what factories were doing. They were producing too many Model Ts, too many radios, too many this, too many that. And because of that, they needed to find ways to sell them to us, because if they didn't, they would start losing money. But the problem is they already tapped into the market of people that actually had money to buy it, kind of that upper 20, 30%. They had already bought theirs. So what do you do when you've already tapped a market dry? What they did is they create debt. The debt becomes this big thing in the 1920s, where in order to sell these overproduced Model Ts, these overproduced radios, these overproduced everything, they start to create programs that allow people that don't have money to buy them anyway. One of the examples of that is going to be installment plans. And what the installment plan was basically, it's like when you buy a car today. You put a down payment down, then you make monthly payments. Okay, and when you do that, it allows someone who doesn't have money to buy something to start buying something. And so what ends up happening by the end of this time period, by 1929, so pre-Great Depression, you're going to see over 60% of cars are being bought on installment plans. And you're going to see over 80% of radios being bought on installment plans. Okay, you're also going to see personal debt in America. In 1925, personal debt, that'd be like the debt we hold, not our government, was $1.38 billion. By 1929, it's $3 billion. So our personal debt, just in a 4-year period, more than doubles. Obviously showing that a lot of this economic growth was growth, but it was being driven by debt, and that's not necessarily a long-term sustainable thing. Okay? Another thing that's going to happen is buying on margin. And buying on margin is another type of debt, a type of debt that was used in the stock markets, where banks would loan you money to buy a stock. And they would use as the collateral for the stock itself. So if you weren't making payments on the debt, they would just foreclose on your stock. Now, the problem with that is that if you're not making payments on your debt, it's because your stock already collapsed. So even if the bank does repossess it, that's not going to help you in any way whatsoever. And it's not going to help the bank in any way whatsoever. And so banks are putting themselves in a dangerous position, especially because they would loan you up to 90% on the price of the stock. So you only had to put 10% down. So that puts banks in a very precarious position. And that puts you in a precarious position as far as how much debt load you're carrying. But during this time period, people were over speculating on the stock market and just assuming it would go up forever. And our government wasn't really keeping an eye on the stock market, so it made it seem like a good investment. An example of this would be back in 1928 or 1929, before the stock market collapsed. This is back in March of 29. There were 3 guys. The leader of the group was called Michael Meehan. He's just an investor. And they ended up investing about $7.5 million investing. They invested a couple $1 million in RCA stock. RCA, one of the big companies that sold like record players and other types of electronic entertainment devices, radios, whatnot. Okay. They end up making, just in 8 days, buying stock on the margin, then selling it, then buying it, then selling it. They end up making over $7.5 million. That'd be over $100 million today. So long story short, you could make a lot of money buying on the margin, but the problem is it doesn't always work. And it especially is going to be found out in late 1929 when all of a sudden Black Tuesday hit. What Black Tuesday is basically we had Black Thursday. On October 24th, there was a drop. And a lot of people who recognize that a lot of the stock growth of the 1920s, you can see on that chart, the late 20s, the line was going vertical. The line was on a geometric or exponential growth pattern. And then all of a sudden on Black Thursday, that's that first little decline at the very top of the peak. And a lot of people freaked out. So they closed the stock market on Friday. So Friday, the stock market did not even open. You couldn't buy or sell a stock even if you wanted to. Then on Monday, the 28th, a bunch of wealthy guys got together and tried to just dump money into the stock market to keep it from collapsing, where it kind of held steady just for that day. But then on Black Tuesday, the famous date, you see that massive collapse. It's that 1-inch drop you can kind of see in the midst of the slide. And with that, people lost tons of value. And a lot of banks that had helped people buy stocks as that curve kept going upwards due to the over speculation patterns of American buyers, banks started to realize, oh my goodness, we're not going to make any money back. So they told a bunch of people, you need to sell your stock. Well, once everybody starts panic selling their stocks to try and pay back their margin loans, that's going to create even more of a crisis. And even though there are little mini recoveries all the way down over the next 2 years, at no point does it recover till late 32. And that's when the market kind of hits its low and then stagnates. And then 33 goes up just a little bit with FDR getting elected, but things weren't dramatically better. So with banks not able to get their money back, a lot of banks start to go out of business. And as banks start to go out of business, we see, like in this picture at the bottom right, we start to see runs on banks. Runs on banks are when banks people think are going to go out of business. So everybody sprints to the bank to try and get their money out first. Because back then, we did not have the FDIC. That's going to be a product of the Great Depression. And with that, people are saying, if I don't get my money out of the bank now, I won't be able to get my money out, period. The bank will collapse, and so will my savings accounts with it. And over 40% of the banks in America did, in fact, collapse. And so that means basically all those people that had money in them, all their life savings vanish. And so even though 80% of Americans never owned a single share, over 40% of Americans were affected directly by losing their life savings as a result of the stock market crash. And with that, people obviously have less money, so they can't buy things. Companies start to go out of business for not selling things, so they have to lay off workers. And long story short, unemployment starts increasing. By the end of 29, we had 3.2% unemployment. By the end of 31, we had 8.7, or by the end of 30, excuse me. By the end of 31, we had 15.9. By the end of 32, we had 23.6. By the end of 33, we had 24.9. So unemployment just kept growing until over a quarter of people that we knew of were unemployed. And so the Great Depression has begun. All right, so you see that picture of the guy with his car, which, that car would have cost over $1,000 just a couple weeks before, and now he's just trying to get $100 for it. So people are in hard times. The Great Depression is pretty awful, much worse than any economic crisis any of us have lived through. I hope will continue to prove to be true, but it was bad. It's got a lot of things in America. All right, so now we're going to talk about what life was like in the Great Depression. We're going to try and go through it kind of quickly. And we start with urbanization. The urbanization was already occurring before the Great Depression. The Great Depression is just going to speed it up. Why are so many people moving to the city? Well, a lot of the people were farmers who had given up on farming, or immigrants that had come to the country, just like we saw in previous eras. Okay, people sometimes went just for the entertainment purpose because there was still cultures. Again, all the things we've seen. But in a Great Depression period, there's even more of a desire for it. Desire for like soup lines or bread kitchens, or a lot of churches would step up and like provide social welfare type programs to people. And so people were going to cities. Now, having said that, a lot of cities couldn't take care of all these people migrating around the country looking for opportunities. So famously, you see signs like you see in this picture where the local Chamber of Commerce is basically saying, don't come to our city. We have no opportunities here. You need to find another place. And that becomes very synonymous with the 1930s. Another thing that becomes synonymous with city life in the 1930s are Hoovervilles. And what are Hoovervilles? They're basically the nickname for these little villages of shanties that pop up all around America as people are now homeless, so many people homeless, and so they're just trying to find anywhere to live. And so a lot of them are just collecting scrap or collecting trash and just trying to create these little villages that they can live in. And obviously it's not a nice place to live, and people are naming them Hoover because they're blaming President Hoover for their problems, which, it's not totally his fault, but he also didn't do a very good job solving it, and so that's going to cause a lot of people to get very upset with him. In the midst of all this turmoil people are experiencing, we see kind of the social gospel grows. A lot of urban churches are going to start to, try to meet the needs of people. As you can see in this picture, that would be called a breadline. Something you see a lot of in the Great Depression where, just churches or local governments or other people would just provide free food, and these lines would stretch for blocks sometimes as people were just desperate to get their hands on anything. Ironically, one of the most famous things out of the 1930s is that this was the golden age of Hollywood. Where Hollywood starts to invest a lot of money in making movies because they recognize a lot of people had free time, which when you're unemployed, it does give you a lot of free time. But they also had very little money. So to get anybody to actually come see a movie, they felt like they had to invest a lot and make very good ones. We're going to see a lot of famous movies during this time period come out. All Quiet on the Western Front, Dracula, King Kong, stuff like that. Two of the most famous would be Gone with the Wind, and then that one, Wizard of Oz, which a lot of you are probably familiar with. But long story short, this becomes the era where Hollywood truly becomes like a big institution in the United States, as a lot of people continue to see movies even in the midst of the economic crisis. It was just a good way to escape the realities of the time period. It would get you out of the weather. You could be inside a room for several hours a day. Food was pretty cheap back then. Popcorn and peanuts and soda and stuff like that was really inexpensive. And so this is the era where that becomes part of our movie diet, so to speak, and our expectations of going to a movie. But either way, Hollywood, big deal. A lot of people view it as an escape of reality. All right, another thing that becomes very synonymous with the 20s is the song "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" It's been on the AP exam several times. It's a famous song by an artist named Rudy Valley, where it's basically a song. Feel free to watch it on YouTube. I'm not going to hook a link to here. I have no idea how to do that technologically. But "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime" is just a song from the perspective of a guy who used to have everything, and now he's basically homeless and jobless in the Great Depression, and he's just begging to spare a dime. And it sells massively, becomes a huge hit on the radio throughout large chunks of the 1930s, probably in large part because people could identify so much with the message of, in the 20s and in the progressive era, things were so well, and now we are just begging for a dime. And so then in the 20s and in the progressive era, things were so well, and now we are just begging for a dime. And so that becomes a big deal. All right, another thing that becomes synonymous with life in the Great Depression was just the amount of people that had to migrate as a result of it. And the most famous example of migration that occurred in the 30s, driven by Great Depression needs, is going to be the migration of what were called the Okies and the Arkies. It was just a derogatory term used by society to describe people that were displaced by the Dust Bowl. Now, the Dust Bowl was a period out in the Great Plains, especially the Oklahoma, Kansas, Upper Texas kind of area, where due to over-farming and drought, a lot of fields just got dried out. And you see pictures like this. This would be called a black blizzard in this time period, where dust is just blowing around. It would destroy farms. It would destroy livestock. It could cause health problems for people that breathed in too much of it. And so what we end up seeing is basically a whole region of our country gets destroyed by the Dust Bowl. And a lot of these farmers, some of them directly by the Dust Bowl, others of them just displaced because they couldn't make it in the overproduction era of farming, are going to have to start migrating elsewhere. Some of them go to cities where they, seek jobs and other aid there. Others go to the southeast or the west, like California especially, to seek opportunities. Many of them become sharecroppers. Many of them become just peasants going from town to town. We start to see hobo culture, it was called, where a lot of homeless people will just start riding the trains all around America, riding the rails, it was called. It was a very popular pastime. People could just keep migrating and looking for opportunities that just generally weren't there. We are going to see some famous cultural results of this. One example of that would be Dorothea Lange, who goes around America as part of the New Deal, taking photographs of people to raise awareness of some of the programs that the New Deal had in the 1930s to help farmers. This being the most famous of her pictures. Migrant Mother, it's called. You can see the details there listed at the bottom. But again, it just kind of shows you the destitute nature, just the hopelessness of a person trying to survive in this time period. And so you see a lot of that. You see it also in the works of John Steinbeck. He's an author. He writes novels, The Mice and Men, The Grapes of Wrath. And it's basically just stories about people in California who were displaced farmers that are now just struggling to get through. And these books became very popular and become cultural staples, in large part probably because so many people could identify with them. Another person who gets really famous in this area is songwriter Woody Guthrie, who's going to produce a lot of songs that kind of tap into this. He has an album called the Dust Bowl Ballads, which just has a lot of songs from the perspective of someone who's just struggling as a farmer who migrated, as Woody Guthrie's family had to migrate by getting displaced. He ended up in California. And then probably his most famous song he ever wrote, and it becomes like a national song, was the song This Land Is Your Land, which he writes in the late 1930s, I believe it was, just talking about his time where he was going across the country, and whereas people in fancy cars would not stop to pick him up, but then one guy stopped and picked him up in an old beat-up pickup truck and took him back with his family and fed him and treated him nice. And he decided at that point that America needed socialism because capitalism just wasn't working. And so he writes the song This Land Is Your Land about how we all need to share the country, et cetera, et cetera. And it becomes a big part of American culture. All right, so while all that's going on, with all this suffering going on, we start to see a significant debate over government's role in the Great Depression, with conservatives on the one hand saying no, in market-based economies, there's just ups and downs, you have to weather the storms. And then more progressive elements of our government are saying, no, the government needs to step in and do something more active. Well, the president in charge during this early time period was Hoover. He'd just been elected in 1928. And so he's going to be there for the first 4 full years of the Depression. Well, 3.5 full years of the Depression. 3.5 full, I don't think that works. But whatever, you get the idea. And so what is Hoover going to do? Well, Hoover believes generally in rugged individualism, where basically he says it is not the government's responsibility to fix things. The government should not get involved. If it would do, will create the welfare state. And the welfare state, people will become lazy. They'll become dependent on the government. So those are all Hoover's views. So generally, he tried to avoid doing anything. He made a series of radio addresses that you can kind of see in a real lo-fi image here, where he kept trying to make speeches saying, no, we don't need to panic. The economy's fine. Everything's fine. We've turned the corner. All is well. And we hadn't. So people are going to lose faith in him. One thing he then did in 1930, and this might just show his kind of conservative bent towards things, is he decides to pass the Hawley-Smoot tariff. So the Hawley-Smoot tariff, he believed, would help us get through the Great Depression by protecting American industry. So it raised the tariff that was already floating around the low 40s up to roughly 52 to 55%, the highest tariff we've ever had in the history of the United States. And with that tariff going up, basically you take an already bad economy, which was bad, and it's going to limit almost 70% of international trade coming and going from the United States. And so that's going to take the Great Depression, which was already bad in our country, pretty bad in Europe, and it's going to make it much, much worse in Europe and a little bit worse in our country. And so looking back, historians widely pan that this was a good idea for him to do, but conservatives believe in the tariff back in that time period, so he went with what he knew, and it didn't work. Then, as the midterm elections of 1930 roll around and Democrats just trounce the Republicans who are in charge of the government, Hoover now realizes he has to take a more active step, or else he's not going to get reelected. So in 1932, he's going to create the RFC, and the RFC was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which basically is going to set aside several $billion in a group. The group is called the RFC, this Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and they are going to then take the money and give it to companies that are creating jobs. So it's going to build infrastructure, it's going to support banks, it's going to support automobile manufacturers in an effort to keep them all from collapsing. The most famous example of what the RFC did is it's going to give money to a group to build a dam, and the dam is going to be named for Herbert Hoover, and it's going to be called the Hoover Dam, you probably heard of. And so basically the RFC is there. Now the RFC is going to politically be catastrophic, because with all these people starving, and with Hoover himself saying, no, we can't give money to people, it'll make them lazy, but he's giving money to corporations. He's giving money to banks, and the corporations and the banks were the ones who caused the Depression in most people's eyes, in which case politically this is going to be a big problem for him. Another major political problem for him is going to be the Bonus Army March, where in 1932, to make a very long story short, a group of veterans from World War I marched on Washington, D.C., demanding a bonus that was promised to them in the 1924 Adjusted Compensation Act, which wasn't supposed to be paid until 1944. But a lot of the veterans are starving to death and they're just desperate for money. And so they march on Washington demanding their bonus get paid early. And you can see this picture where a bunch of these veterans are now on the steps of the Capitol building and they're demanding their money. Now, Hoover says they can't. The government doesn't have money. They need to go home. And some of them did, but many of them didn't. So at that point, he's going to appoint Douglas MacArthur, a general from the United States, to come in with the army and clear the Capitol. And they're going to do it. They're going to use tear gas. They're going to use tanks. They're going to set a lot of these buildings on fire that these veterans built. And it's going to end up killing 2 people. 2 babies actually die from smoke inhalation. So when you as a president in an election year are viewed as A, just giving money to rich people, B, making the Depression worse with the Hawley-Smoot tariff, C, telling people, no, you just got to tough through it. We're all going to be a bunch of rugged individuals. And then D, you kill babies while attacking veterans. Hoover obviously just didn't get politics. And so in the election of 32, you got one candidate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promises a new deal to Americans, basically saying, when I take over, I'll do something. I don't know what yet, but I'll do something. And you've got Hoover saying, nope, we've just got to weather the storm. Their slogan is actually, it could have been worse. That's not a good slogan when you're running for re-election. But FDR wins. And he doesn't just win, he wins big, as you can see on that electoral map, where FDR takes pretty much everybody except a little bit of New England and Pennsylvania and Delaware. And so the rest of the country is saying, enough of Hoover. We want something different. And with that, FDR is going to give them something dramatically different. The first thing he's going to do, unlike Hoover, who just made speeches saying, hey, whatever, FDR actively goes out of his way and tries to instill confidence. He does it with his first inaugural address, where most famous quote from that, talking about our response to the Great Depression, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And then he's going to go on and make a series of fireside chats where he goes on the radio from time to time to just reassure us that all is going to be well, that he's fighting. He gives us lists of things he's doing. He's given us good news coming from the economy, like, hey, a factory opened in Alabama, 200 people got a job, just stuff like that to try and reassure us. And he's much better at it than Hoover, and so it's going to go much better for him, and he's going to make himself very popular doing this. Another thing he's going to do, he's going to implement the economic theories of John Maynard Keynes. So it's called Keynesian economics. He was a British economist that basically said governments needed to take a more active role in the economy, where you don't just do Adam Smith's capitalism, laissez-faire, free market type ideas, but you also don't do Karl Marx and command theory, where you just control all the products and all the production methods. He said, but instead you do like a more of a middle ground, where the government plays a very active role in the economy. So when things are good, you tax the economy to keep it from growing too much, so that you don't end up with these bubbles that burst like we saw in the 20s. But then when the economy starts going bad, you start spending. So basically, it's a heavily regulated economy where you try to limit the bubbles, but you also limit the busts. And he said that's going to be the model for his presidency. So instead of just rolling with the punches of the market, he's going to play an active role in implementing this. Part of that is called pump priming, where it's an idea that comes from Keynes, where if an economy is bad, you dump money into it. And by dumping money into it, it'll get it going again. And we're going to see FDR do that with his New Deal. And we'll look at a bunch of the different programs that do it here in a minute. Likewise, we're also going to see him spend into deficits. Why? Because in the 1920s, we weren't taxing enough. And so we're going to have to raise taxes at some point in order to pay down these debts. But in the meantime, we just have to spend the money. Some people say, well, you shouldn't have deficits. His response is, people need to eat today. I will worry about the deficits tomorrow. And so that's going to help make him popular as well, as it shows him kind of setting aside political ideology for the welfare of voters and whatnot. Okay, and then the last thing, he's going to implement what historians call the brain trust. He called them the brains trust, but whatever. Where basically it's kind of like the idea of fighting Bob La Follette, who had the Wisconsin idea saying, hey, I'm going to put a bunch of advisors around me that are experts in fields, give me ideas. That's going to be his brains trust. And then he will take the ideas he thinks are a good idea, get rid of the ones he thinks aren't good ideas, and implement them as part of his New Deal. And so what is, we are now